and thus to escape justice. George Mason built on Davy's position, asking, shall the man who has practiced corruption, and by that means procured his appointment in the first instance, be suffered to escape punishment by repeating his guilt? Mason's concern was straightforward. He feared that presidents would win election by improperly influencing members of the Electoral College. Governor Morris later echoed this point, urging that the executive ought therefore to be impeachable for corrupting his electors. Taken together, these debates demonstrate an essential point. The framers knew that a president who abused power to manipulate elections presented the greatest possible threat to the Constitution. After all, the beating heart of the framers' project was a commitment to popular sovereignty. At a time when democratic self-government existed almost nowhere on earth, the framers imagined a society where power flowed from and returned to the people. That is why the President and members of Congress must stand before the public for re-election on fixed terms. And if a president abuses his power to corrupt those elections, he threatens the entire system. As Professor Carlin explained in her testimony,
drawing a foreign government into our elections is an especially serious abuse of power because it undermines democracy itself. Our Constitution begins with the words, "We the people," for a reason. Our government, in James Madison's words, derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people. And the way it derives these powers is through elections. Elections matter, both to the legitimacy of our government and to all of our individual freedoms, because as the Supreme Court declared more than a century ago, voting is preservative of all rights.
Professor Carlin is right. Elections matter. They make our government legitimate, and they protect our freedom. A president who abuses his power in order to kneecap political opponents and spread Russian conspiracy theories, a president who uses his office to ask for, or even worse, to compel foreign nations to meddle in our elections, is a president who attacks the very foundation of our liberty. That is a grave abuse of power. It is an unprecedented betrayal of the national interest. It is a shocking corruption of the election process. And it is without doubt a crime against the Constitution, warranting, demanding removal from office. The framers expected that free elections would be the usual means of protecting our freedoms. But they knew that a president who sought foreign assistance in his campaign must be removed from office before he could steal the next election. In a last-ditch legal defense of their client, the president's lawyers argue that impeachment and removal are subject to statutory crimes or to offenses against established law, that the president cannot be impeached because he has not committed a crime. This view is completely wrong. It has no support in constitutional text and structure, original meaning, congressional precedents, common sense, or the consensus of credible experts. In other words, it conflicts with every relevant consideration. Professor Gerhardt succinctly captured the consensus view in his testimony.
Professor Gerhardt, does a high crime and misdemeanor require an actual statutory crime?
No, it plainly does not. Everything we know about the history of impeachment reinforces the conclusion that impeachable offenses do not have to be crimes, and again, not all crimes are impeachable offenses. We look again at the context and gravity of the misconduct.
This position was echoed by the Republicans' expert witness, Professor Turley, in his written testimony. There he stated that it, quote, "It is possible to establish a case for impeachment based on a non-criminal allegation of abuse of power." He also stated, "It is clear that high crimes and misdemeanors can encompass non-criminal conduct." More recently, Professor Turley, again the Republican witness at our hearing, wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post entitled, "Where the Trump Defense Goes Too Far." In this piece, he stated that the President's argument is as politically unwise as it is constitutionally short-sighted. He added, if successful, it would also come at a considerable cost for the Constitution. Although I disagree with Professor Turley on many, many issues, here he is clearly right. And I might say the same thing of then-House Manager Lindsey Graham, who in President Clinton's trial flatly rejected the notion that impeachable offenses are limited to violations of established law. Here is what he said.
What's a high crime? How about if an important person hurts somebody of low means? It's not very scholarly, but I think it's the truth. I think that's what they meant by high crimes. Doesn't even have to be a crime. It's just when you start using your office and you're acting in a way that hurts people, you've committed a high crime.
There are many reasons why high crimes and misdemeanors are not and cannot be limited to violations of the criminal code. We address them at length in the briefs we have filed and the report of the House Judiciary Committee respecting these articles of impeachment. But I would like to highlight a few especially important considerations. I'll tick through them quickly. First, there is the matter of the historical record. The framers could not have meant to limit impeachment to statutory crimes. Presidents are to be impeached and removed from office for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. But bribery was not made a statutory crime until 1837. Second, the President's position is contradicted by the Constitution's text. The framers repeatedly referred to crimes, offenses, and punishment elsewhere in the Constitution. But here they refer to high crimes. That matters. It matters because the phrase high crimes refers to offenses against the state rather than to workaday crimes. And it matters because the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors had a rich history in England where it had been applied in many, many cases that did not involve crimes under British law. When the framers added high crimes here, but nowhere else in the Constitution, they made a deliberate choice. Any doubt on that score is dispelled by the framers' own statements. In Federalist Number 65, Alexander Hamilton explained that impeachable offenses are defined fundamentally by the abuse or violation of some public trust. A few years later, James Wilson, a Constitutional Convention delegate, agreed with Hamilton. Wilson stated, impeachments and offenses and offenders impeachable come not within the sphere of ordinary jurisprudence. They are founded on different principles, are governed by different maxims, and are directed to different objects. George Mason expressed concern that the President might abuse the pardon power to, quote, screen from punishment those whom he had secretly instigated to commit a crime, and thereby prevent a discovery of his own guilt. Sound familiar? James Madison responded directly to Mason's concern because Mason's concern was that the pardon power might be too broad. The President might misuse his broad pardon power to pardon his own co-conspirators and prevent the discovery of his own guilt. Madison responded, if the President be connected in any suspicious manner with any person, and there be grounds to believe he will shelter him, the House of Representatives can impeach him. They can remove him if found guilty. At the North Carolina ratifying convention, James Iredell, who would go on to serve on the Supreme Court, responded to the same concern. He assured delegates that if the President abused his power with, quote, some corrupt motive or other, he would be liable to impeachment. In the early 1800s, this understanding was echoed by Supreme Court Justice Story, who wrote his famous treatise on the Constitution. There he rejected the equation of crimes and impeachable offenses, which he stated must be examined upon very broad and comprehensive principles of public policy and duty. Later in American history, Chief Justice and former President William Howard Taft, as well as Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, publicly stated that impeachable offenses are not limited to crimes, but instead capture a broader range of misconduct. Indeed, under Chief Justice Taft, the Supreme Court unanimously observed that abuse of the president's pardon power to frustrate the enforcement of court orders would suggest resort to impeachment. And this is square. Now notice, pardon power is unlimited. What they're saying here is abuse of the pardon power. Use of the pardon power for corrupt motive was impeachable. And if all that authority is not enough to convince you, there is more. Historians have shown that American colonists before the Revolution and American states after the Revolution, but before 1787, all impeached officials for non-criminal conduct. Over the past 2 centuries, moreover, a strong majority of the impeachments voted by the House have included one or more allegations that did not charge a violation of criminal law. Indeed, the Senate has convicted and removed multiple judges on non-criminal grounds. Judge Archibald was removed in 1912 for non-criminal speculation in coal properties. Judge Ritter was removed in 1936 for the non-criminal offense of bringing his court into scandal and disrepute. During Judge Ritter's case, one of my predecessors as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee stated expressly, "We do not assume the responsibility of proving that the respondent is guilty of a crime, as that term is known to criminal jurisprudence." What is true for judges is also true for presidents, at least on this point. The House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against President Nixon. Each of them encompassed many acts that did not violate federal law. One of the articles, obstruction of Congress, involved no allegations of any legal violation. And it is worth reflecting on why President Nixon was forced to resign. Most Americans are familiar with the story. The House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment in July 1974. Those articles passed with bipartisan support, although most Republicans stood by President Nixon. Then the smoking tape came out. Within a week, almost everyone who supported the president a week before changed his position, and the president was forced to resign because of what was revealed on the smoking gun tape. Within a week, Senator Goldwater and others from the Senate went to the president and said, "You won't have a single vote in the Senate. You must resign or you will be removed from office," because of the evidence on the smoking gun tape. But what was on the smoking gun tape? The smoking gun tape were recordings of President Nixon instructing White House officials to pressure the CIA and the FBI to end the Watergate investigation. No law explicitly prohibited that conversation. It was not in that sense a crime. But President Nixon had abused his power. He had tried to use 2 government agencies, the FBI and the CIA, for his personal benefit. His impeachment and removal was certain, and he announced his resignation within days. Decades later, in President Clinton's case, the Judiciary Committee reported on the articles of impeachment stated, "The actions of President Clinton do not have to rise to the level of violating the federal statute regarding obstruction of justice in order to justify impeachment." There is thus overwhelming authority against restricting impeachments to violations of established or statutory law. Every relevant principle of constitutional law compels that result. So does common sense. Impeachment is not a punishment for crimes. Impeachment exists to address threats to the political system, applies only to political officials, and responds not by imprisonment or fines, but only by stripping political power. It would make no sense to say that a president who engages in horrific abuses must be allowed to remain in office unless Congress had anticipated his or her specific conduct in advance and written a statute expressly outlawing it. For one thing, that would be practically impossible. As Justice Story observed, the threats posed by presidential abuse are of so various and complex a character that it would be almost absurd to attempt a comprehensive list. The Constitution is not a suicide pact. It does not leave us stuck with presidents who abuse their power in unforeseen ways that threaten our security and democracy. Until recently, it did not occur to me that our president would call a foreign leader and demand a sham investigation meant to kneecap his political opponents, all in exchange for releasing vital military aid that the president was already required by law to provide. No one anticipated that a president would stoop to this misconduct, and Congress has passed no specific law to make this behavior a crime. Yet this is precisely the kind of abuse that the framers had in mind when they wrote the impeachment clause. And when they charged Congress with determining when the president's conduct was so clearly wrong, so definitely beyond the pale, so threatening to the constitutional order as to require his removal. And that is why we are here today. You must judge for yourselves whether justice will be had for President Trump's crimes against our freedom and the Constitution. I will conclude by highlighting a few points that merit special emphasis as you apply the law of impeachment to President Trump's misconduct. First, impeachment is not for petty offenses. The president's conduct must constitute, as Masons put it, a great and dangerous offense against the nation, offenses that threaten the Constitution. Second, impeachable offenses involve wrongdoing that reveal the president as a continuing threat if he is allowed to remain in office. In other words, we fully recognize that impeachment does not exist for a mistake. It does not apply to acts that are merely unwise or unpopular. Impeachment is reserved for deliberate decisions by the president to embark on a course of conduct that betrays his oath of office and does violence to the Constitution. When the president has engaged in such conduct, and when there is strong evidence that he will do so again, when he has told us he'll do so again, when he has told us that it's okay to invite interference from a foreign power into our next election, the case for removal is at its peak. This is certainly the case when he invites, indeed attempts to compel, a foreign government to help him subvert the integrity of our next election. There can be no greater threat to the Republic. Finally, high crimes and misdemeanors involve conduct that is recognizably wrong to a reasonable, honorable citizen. The framers adopted a standard for impeachment that could stand the test of time. At the same time, the structure of the Constitution implies that impeachable offenses should not come as a surprise. Impeachment is aimed at presidents who act as if they are above the law, at presidents who believe their own interests are more important than those of the nation, and thus at presidents who ignore right and wrong in pursuit of their own gain. Abuse, betrayal, corruption. Here are each of the core offenses the framers feared most. The president's abuse of power, his betrayal of the national interest, and his corruption of our elections plainly qualify as great and dangerous offenses. President Trump has made clear in word and deed that he will persist in such conduct if he is not removed from power. He poses a continuing threat to our nation, to the integrity of our elections, to our democratic order. He must not remain in power one moment longer.
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, President's Council, we will now walk through the President's abuse of power, the corrupt object of his scheme, his three official acts carrying out his scheme, his attempted cover-up and exposure, and the harm to our nation and continuing threat caused by his misconduct. Let's start first with the object of the President's scheme. And Senators, we have today provided handouts that you can follow along in our slides. So as this first slide indicates, in this portion of our presentation, we will discuss the evidence that shows overwhelmingly that President Trump directed this scheme with corrupt intent, with one corrupt objective: to obtain foreign assistance in his re-election bid in the 2020 United States presidential election. We will walk through first how the president wanted Ukraine to help in his re-election campaign. He wanted Ukraine to publicly announce 2 investigations, one into his political rival, Joe Biden, and the second into the debunked conspiracy theory related to Ukraine interference in the 2016 election. President Trump himself later confirmed this intent in public statements. We will then explain how we know these investigations were solely for President Trump's personal political gain. First, President Trump made clear he cared only about the announcement of the investigations, not the actual investigations. Second, President Trump similarly made clear he cared only about the big stuff, meaning his political investigations. Third, he used his personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, who repeatedly told us he was pursuing the investigations in his capacity as the president's personal lawyer, and that this wasn't about foreign policy. Fourth and fifth, there is no real dispute that these investigations were never part of an official U.S. policy, and they, in fact, went outside official channels. The Department of Justice even publicly confirmed that they were never asked to talk to Ukraine about these investigations. Never. 6 multiple officials who knew what was going on repeatedly reported these concerns to supervisors and even the NSC legal advisors. 7th, Ukraine expressed concerns multiple times that these were political investigations and Ukraine didn't want to get involved in domestic U.S. politics. 8th, the White House tried to bury the call. 9th, President Trump himself told us he really wanted and cared about, in his own words, in many public statements. And finally, despite the President Council's attempts to justify his actions, the evidence makes clear that President Trump did not care about anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. This was only about one thing: his political investigations. You're following along on the slide. Now, as I mentioned, the object of the president's scheme is clear: 2 investigations to help his political reelection. The Constitution grants the president broad authority to conduct U.S. foreign policy. He is our commander-in-chief and chief diplomat. When the President of the United States calls a foreign leader, a president's first and only objective should be to get foreign leaders to do what's best for the U.S. national interest, consistent with the faithful execution of his oath of office, and consistent with official U.S. policy. But on July 25, when President Trump called the president of Ukraine, President Trump did the opposite. Instead of following official U.S. talking points, instead of listening to his staff on what was important to our national interests, President Trump asked Ukraine for something that benefited only himself: his political investigations. And not only did these investigations diverge from U.S. national interests, as you'll hear, President Trump's actions harmed our national security. In putting himself above our country, he put our country at risk. And that is why his actions are so dangerous. Now let's take a moment and look carefully at the 2 investigations that President Trump sought from Ukraine. which are at the heart of the president's scheme, and how he stood to benefit politically from Ukraine's announcement of each. As you can see on the slide, the first investigation was, of course, of former Vice President Biden. Let's go straight to that July 25 telephone call again, where President Trump stated clearly each of these investigations he wanted. So let's start with Vice President Joe Biden and the removal of corrupt prosecutor in Ukraine. The first investigation related to former Vice President Joe Biden and the Ukrainian gas company Burisma Holdings, on whose board his son, Hunter Biden, used to sit. President Trump himself summarized the theory behind his request in broad strokes in his July 25 call with President Zelensky. Here's what he said. The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that, so that whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into that, it sounds horrible to me. Now let's look carefully at the investigation President Trump was asking for and what it was based on. In short, President Trump asked for the investigation into Biden based on a made-up theory that no one agreed with. No one. We'll go into this in more detail, but at a high level, the allegation is that late in 2015, Biden pressured Ukraine to remove the then Prosecutor General, Viktor Shokin, by threatening to withhold approximately $1 billion in loan guarantees if he was not removed. According to this theory, Vice President Biden did this in order to help his son in a company called Burisma. Vice President Biden's son sat on the board of Burisma. As the theory goes, Vice President Biden tried to remove Ukraine's prosecutor, all to make sure the prosecutor wouldn't investigate that specific company, Burisma, because, again, his son was on the board. Then, senators, if that doesn't sound far-fetched and complicated to you, it should. So let's take this step by step and start from the beginning. In 2014, Vice President Biden's son, Hunter, joined the board of the Ukrainian natural gas firm Burisma Holdings. At the time, Burisma's owner, a Ukrainian oligarch and former government minister, was under investigation. In 2015, Viktor Shokin became Ukraine's Prosecutor General, a job similar to Attorney General in the United States. Although Shokin vowed to keep investigating Burisma amid an international push to root out corruption in Ukraine, he allowed the Burisma investigation to go dormant. Allowed it to go dormant. That is when he was removed. He was not actively investigating Burisma. He had let it go dormant. Moreover, Shokin was widely perceived as ineffective and corrupt. George Kent, the second most senior official at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv at the time, described Shokin as, quote, a typical Ukraine prosecutor who lived a lifestyle far in excess of his government salary, who never prosecuted anybody known for having committed a crime and covered up crimes that were known to have been committed. In late 2015, Vice President Biden, who had assumed a significant role in U.S. policy toward Ukraine, publicly called for the removal of Mr. Shokin because of his failure to adequately combat corruption. But Vice President Biden wasn't alone. The European Union, our European allies, the International Monetary Fund, reformers inside Ukraine also wanted Mr. Shokin removed to reform the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office, to reform it. Reforming the Prosecutor General's office was also supported on a bipartisan basis by the Ukrainian caucus here in the Senate. On February 12, 2016, after Vice President Biden had urged for the removal of Mr. Shokin, but before the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove him, a bipartisan group of senators, including Senators Portman, Durbin, Shaheen, Ron Johnson, Murphy, Kirk, Blumenthal, and Sherrod Brown, sent a letter to President Poroshenko that urged him to make urgent reforms to the Prosecutor General's office. The month after the senators sent that letter, Mr. Shokin was fired. He was fired. So let's be very, very clear. Vice President Biden called for the removal of this prosecutor at the official direction of U.S. policy because the prosecutor was widely perceived as corrupt. And with the support of all our international allies, his actions were therefore supported by the executive branch, Congress, and the international community. Common sense would tell us that this allegation against Joe Biden is false and that there was no legitimate basis for any investigation. But there are several other reasons. You know that the only reason President Trump wanted Ukraine to announce the investigation into Biden that was also solely for his very own personal benefit. So if you look at the slide, it'll summarize some points. First, none of the 17 witnesses in the House's inquiry said there was any factual basis for this allegation, not one of the 17. To the contrary, they testified it was false. Second, as I mentioned, the former Prosecutor General, Vice President Biden, was widely considered to be corrupt and failed to investigate corruption in Ukraine. Thus, removing him from office would only increase the chances that Burisma would be investigated for possible corruption. Third, because the prosecutor was so corrupt, Vice President Biden calling for his removal was also at the direction of official U.S. policy and undertaken with the unanimous support of our allies. Fourth, the successor to the fired Ukrainian Prosecutor General admitted that Vice President Biden's son didn't do anything wrong in connection with Burisma. So the entire premise of the investigation that the president wanted Ukraine to pursue was simply false. Finally, President Trump didn't care about any of this until 2019. But when Vice President Biden became the front runner for the Democratic presidential nomination, and polls showed that he had the largest head-to-head lead against President Trump, that became a problem. Let's start with the first and second points. Vice President Biden's conduct was uniformly validated by the witnesses in the House investigation who confirmed his conduct was consistent with U.S. policy. Every single witness who was asked about the allegations again said that Biden had nothing to do with it and it was false. They testified that he acted properly. Every witness with knowledge of this issue testified that Vice President Biden was carrying out official U.S. policy in calling for Shokin's removal. Shokin was corrupt. and this witnesses explain the U.S. was not alone in this view. All of our European allies also supported this action. There is simply no evidence, nothing, nada, in the record to support this baseless allegation. I'd like to go through some of that testimony now. First, here are Dr. Hill and Mr. Holmes, so let's watch.
Now, Dr. Hill, are you aware of any evidence to support the allegations against Vice President Biden?
I'm not, no.
And in fact, Mr. Holmes, the former Prosecutor General of Ukraine, who Vice President Biden encouraged to fire, was actually corrupt, is that right?
Correct.
And was not pursuing corruption investigations and prosecutions, right?
My understanding is the Prosecutor General at the time, Shokin, was not at that time pursuing investigations of Burisma or the Bidens.
And in fact, removing that corrupt prosecutor general was part of the United States anti-corruption policy, isn't that correct?
That's correct, and not just us, but all of our allies and other institutions that were involved in Ukraine at the time.
Ambassador Yovanovitch, too, confirmed these points. Let's watch her testify.
And in fact, when Vice President Biden acted to remove the former corrupt prosecutor in Ukraine, did he do so as part of official United States policy?
Official U.S. policy.
And that was
endorsed and was the policy of a number of other international stakeholders, other countries, other monetary institutions, financial institutions.
And similarly, when asked if there was any factual basis to support the allegations about Biden, George Kent replied, none whatsoever. Lieutenant Colonel Vidman and Ms. Williams also confirmed that they are not aware of any credible evidence to support the notion that Vice President Biden did anything wrong. And Ambassador Volker testified that the Biden allegations were not credible and that Biden, quote, respects his duties of higher office. Now, as I mentioned, there was also concrete reason that the U.S. government wanted Shokin removed. As David Holmes, a senior official at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, testified, by the time that Shokin was finally removed in 2016, there were strong concerns that Shokin himself was corrupt and not investigating potential corruption in the country. In fact, part of the concern was that Shokin was not investigating Burisma. Under Shokin, the investigation into the owner of Burisma for earlier conduct had stalled and was dormant. That was part of the reason why the United States and other countries wanted to remove Shokin. Because of this, and as confirmed by witness testimony we will hear shortly, calling for Shokin's replacement would actually increase the chances that Burisma would be investigated. In other words, Shokin was corrupt and not investigating allegations against Burisma. So when Vice President Biden was calling for Shokin's removal and advocating for his replacement, it would actually increase chances of Burisma's investigation. Ambassador Yovanovitch made this point during her testimony. Let's listen.
And in fact, if he helped to remove a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor general who was not prosecuting enough corruption, that would increase the chances that corrupt companies in Ukraine would be investigated. Isn't that right?
One would think so.
And that could include Burisma, right?
Yes.
President Trump and his allies have tried to justify President Trump's withholding a military aid and a White House meeting unless Ukraine announced the investigations he wanted, by saying it's the same thing Vice President did when he called for Ukraine to remove its corrupt prosecutor. It is not the same thing. As you've just heard, Vice President Biden followed official U.S. policy. He went through official channels to remove the prosecutor that was corrupt. And he did it with the support of our allies. That is the exact opposite of what President Trump did. He pushed Ukraine for an investigation that has no basis, that no one agreed with, that was not at all U.S. policy, and that only benefited him. George Kent addressed this very point during his testimony. Let's listen.
And Mr. Kent and Mr. Taylor, the defenders of the president's behavior have made a big deal out of the fact that Vice President Biden encouraged the Ukrainians to remove a corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutor, 2016, Mr. Shokin. And in fact, Senator Rand Paul on Sunday said, and I quote him, "They're impeaching the President Trump for exactly the same thing that Joe Biden did." Is that correct? Is what the president did in his phone call and what Joe Biden did in terms of Mr. Shokin, are those exactly the same things? And if not, how are they different?
I do not think they are the same things. What former Vice President Biden requested of former President of Ukraine, Poroshenko, was the removal of a corrupt prosecutor general, Viktor Shokin, who had undermined a program of assistance that we had spent, again, U.S. taxpayer money, to try to build an independent investigator unit to go after corrupt prosecutors. And there was a case called the Diamond Prosecutor case in which Shokin destroyed the entire ecosystem that we were trying to help create. The investigators, the judges who issued the warrants, the law enforcement that had warrants to do the wiretapping, everybody to protect his former driver whom he'd made a prosecutor. That's what Joe Biden was asking, remove the corrupt prosecutor.
So Joe Biden was participating in an open effort, established whole of government effort to address corruption in Ukraine.
That is correct.
Great. So, Mr. Kent, as you look at this whole mess, Rudy Giuliani, President Trump, in your opinion, was this a comprehensive and whole of government effort to end corruption in Ukraine?
Referring to the requests in July?
Exactly.
I would not say so. No, sir.
In short, the allegations against Vice President Biden are groundless. And so there is no comparison, none at all, between what he did and the President Trump's abuse of power. Now, let's turn to the third point. Part of the allegation against former Vice President Biden is that he pushed for the corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor's removal in order to protect his son from the investigation. In fact, the president's claim about being concerned about corruption in Ukraine has recently emphasized this component of the theory, that the president wanted Ukraine to investigate Hunter Biden's work on the board of Burisma, not the former vice president. This, too, is false, simply false. You need look no further than the July 25 call and the president's own statements to see that the president wanted the Ukrainians to investigate Vice President Biden. Let's look again at what the president's call said. Quote, "The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. Whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me." The president was clearly asking President Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden. And what did the president say on the White House lawn on October 3rd? When he was asked about the Ukraine scheme, he said, quote, "Well, I think they should, if they were honest about it, you saw the film yesterday, they would start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer." He said, the Bidens, plural. Not one Biden, the Bidens. It's clear that the president wanted what he wanted from Ukraine, an investigation to smear his political rival. But even if the president wanted an investigation of Hunter Biden, there is no basis for that either. Now, how do you know? Well, Ukraine's former prosecutor general admitted that the allegation against Vice President Biden's son was plainly false. You can see it on the slide, his own words, plainly false. Then Ukrainian Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko recanted his earlier allegations and confirmed, quote, Biden was definitely not involved in any wrongdoing involving Burisma. So, even the Ukrainians believe that Biden's son did nothing wrong. The long and short of it is that there was no basis for the investigation that the president was pursuing and pushing. None. He was doing it only for his own political benefit. But let's look at one more important reason why it's clear that President Trump simply wanted a political benefit from Ukraine's announcement of this investigation and didn't care about the underlying conduct. The allegations against Vice President Biden were based on events that occurred in late 2015 and early 2016. They were all well publicized at the time, but as soon as President Trump took office, he increased military support to Ukraine in 2017 and the next year, 2018. But it wasn't until 2019, over 3 years after Vice President Biden called for Shokin's removal, 3 years after, that President Trump started pushing Ukraine to investigate that conduct. So what changed? What changed? Why did President Trump not care at all about Biden's request on the removal of Shokin the year after it happened in 2017 or the next year in 2018? Senators, you know what changed in 2019 when President Trump suddenly cared. It's that Biden got in the race. On April 25, Vice President Biden announced he would run for president in 2020. If President Trump was so concerned about this alleged corruption, why didn't he push Ukraine to investigate when he entered office in 2017? Or in 2018, after Biden gave public remarks about how he pressured Ukraine to remove Shokin? Why did President Trump instead wait until former Vice President Biden was campaigning for the Democratic nomination? Senators, it's obvious. Because President Trump wanted to hurt Vice President Biden's candidacy and help himself politically. He pushed for an investigation in 2019 because that's when it would be valuable to him, President Trump. He pushed for it when it started to become clear that Vice President Biden could beat him. And he had good reason to be concerned. Let's look at the slide about some polls. Throughout the scheme, polling had consistently shown the former vice president handily beating President Trump by significant margins in head-to-head matchups. The chart on the screen shows a Fox News polls emphasizing this point. The chart shows that from March through December, Vice President Biden had consistently led President Trump in national polls by significant margins. So beginning around March, Vice President Biden is beating the president in polls, even on Fox News. In April, Biden officially announces his candidacy. And then when the president gets worried. In May, the president's personal lawyer tells the press that he's planning to travel to Ukraine to urge newly elected President Zelensky to conduct the two investigations, one into Vice President Biden. A Fox News poll showed Biden beating Trump by 11 points. This clearly did not go unnoticed. On May 9, the president's personal lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, said in an interview, and this is a quote, "I guarantee you Joe Biden will not get to Election Day without this being investigated." And by July, right before President Trump's call with President Zelensky, where he asked for the investigation to Biden, the Fox News poll showed Biden beating Trump by 10 points. And then, on July 25th, after years of not caring what Vice President did, does President Trump ask for an investigation in his formidable political rival in the 2020 election. Senators, looking at this timeline of events, it is not difficult to see why the investigation of the Bidens would be helpful to President Trump. The mere announcement of such an investigation would immediately tarnish the former vice president's reputation by embroiling him and his son in a foreign criminal investigation, even if the charges were never pursued, just the mere announcement. And if a foreign country announced a formal investigation into those allegations, it would give allegations against the Bidens an air of credibility and could carry through the election. The evidence is clear. Everyone knew, even Ukraine, that there was no merit to the allegation that Biden called for the removal of Shokin for any illegitimate reason. Biden asked for it because it was consistent with U.S. policy, because Shokin was corrupt and with the backing of our allies. Even President Trump knew there was no basis for this investigation. That is why for years after Shokin's removal, he continued to support Ukraine, never once raised the issue. It wasn't until Biden began beating him in the polls that he called for the investigation. The president asked Ukraine for this investigation for one reason and one reason only, because he knew it would be damaging to an opponent who was consistently beating him in the polls, and therefore it could help him get reelected in 2020. President Trump had the motive, he had the opportunity, and the means to commit this abuse of power. Now let's turn to the second investigation that President Trump wanted. What he wanted is a widely debunked conspiracy theory that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 U.S. election to benefit President Trump's opponent. As we will explain, the allegation that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 elections, just like the allegation that Biden improperly removed the Ukraine prosecutor, has absolutely no basis in fact. In fact, this theory ignored the unanimous conclusions of the U.S. Intelligence Agency, the Congressional Intelligence Committees, and Special Counsel Mueller, which found that Russia attacked our elections. It also went against the Senate Intelligence Committee report, which found no evidence supporting that Ukraine attacked our elections. Nor did any witness support the theory that Ukraine attacked our elections. Indeed, even President Trump's own advisors told him the claim was false. In fact, the one person who told President Trump his theory is true, who was it? You know it was our adversary, Russia, who had everything to gain by deflecting the blame from their attack on Ukraine. Let's look at what President Trump was actually suggesting Ukraine investigate. The theory is this: instead of listening to our entire intelligence community that concluded that Russia interfered in our 2016 election to assist Donald Trump, the new theory says it was Ukraine that interfered in the election to help Hillary Clinton and hurt Donald Trump. One aspect of this conspiracy theory was that the American cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike, which had helped the DNC respond to Russia's cyber attack in 2016, moved a DNC server to Ukraine to prevent the FBI from examining it. Here's what President Trump said about this conspiracy theory during the July 25 call. Quote, I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people. The server, they say Ukraine has it. Once again, if this sounds far-fetched and crazy, it should, because it is. There is simply no factual basis to support this conspiracy theory. Let's walk through the concrete reasons why. First, as I mentioned, our entire U.S. intelligence community, the Senate Select Committees on Intelligence, and Special Counsel Mueller all unanimously found that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 elections. And Russia did it to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. Here's an example of that. This is a conclusion of the Director of National Intelligence report entitled Assessing Russian Activities and Intentions in Recent U.S. Elections. I'll quote a part in it. You can follow along the slide. We assess Russian President Vladimir Putin's ordered and influence campaign in 2016 aimed at U.S. presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. We further assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump. We have high confidence in these judgments, end quote. Clear precedent for President-elect Trump. And here's a conclusion of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Quote, the committee found that the Russia-based Internet Research Agency sought to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election by harming Hillary Clinton's chances of success and supporting Donald Trump at the direction of the Kremlin. The committee found that the Russian government tasked and supported the IRA's interference in the 2016 U.S. elections, end quote. Supporting Donald Trump at the direction of the Kremlin. That's what it said. And here's the special counsel's conclusion. The Mueller report in 2019, quote, as set forth in detail in this report, The special counsel's investigation established that Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election principally through two operations. First, a Russia entity carried out a social media campaign that favored presidential candidate Donald J. Trump and disparaged presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Second, a Russian intelligence service conducted computer intrusion operations against entities, employees, and volunteers working on the Clinton campaign and then released stolen documents. On December 9, 2019, even President Trump's own FBI director, Christopher Wray, stated unequivocally that there is no evidence to support the theory that Ukraine interfered in our election in 2016. Here's a video of that interview. Let's watch.
It's all those threats.
Did the government of Ukraine directly interfere in the 2016 election on the scale that the Russians did?
We have no information that indicates that Ukraine interfered with the 2016 presidential election.
When you see politicians pushing this notion, are you concerned about that in terms of its impact on the American public?
Well, look, there's all kinds of people saying all kinds of things out there. I think it's important for the American people to be thoughtful consumers of information, to think about the sources of it, and to think about the support and predication for what they hear. And I think part of us being well protected against malign foreign influence is to build together an American public that's resilient, that has appropriate media literacy, and that takes its information with a grain of salt.
And Putin has been pushing this theory. And your message to him in terms of the American public?
Stop trying to interfere with our elections.
We recently heard from the president himself that he wanted the CrowdStrike portion of this whole conspiracy in the Ukraine investigated. And I'm hearing you say there's no evidence to support that, as far as you know.
As I said, we at the FBI have no information that would indicate that Ukraine tried to interfere in the 2016 presidential election.
Should the president?
You heard him. He said no information that would indicate that Ukraine tried to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. So to be really, really clear, there is no real dispute that Russia, not Ukraine, attacked our elections. But it's not just that there is no evidence to support this conspiracy theory. It's more dangerous than that. Because where did this theory come from? You guessed it, the Russians. Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian intelligence services perpetuated this false, debunked conspiracy theory. Now remember, there is no dispute among the intelligence community that Russia attacked our 2016 election. The Senate's own Intelligence Committee published a report telling us that as well. So it's no surprise that Russia wants to blame somebody else. In fact, President Trump even said that. President Putin is the one who told him it was Ukraine who interfered in our elections. In short, this theory that the Russians are promoting to interfere yet again in our democratic process and deflect blame from their own attacks against us. But what is so dangerous is that President Trump is helping them perpetuate this. Our own president is helping our adversary attack our processes and to help his own reelection. Dr. Hill, an expert on these matters, explains it in more detail as to why this is very concerning. Let's watch.
This relates to the second thing I want to communicate. Based on questions and statements I've heard, Some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country, and that perhaps, somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves. The unfortunate truth is that Russia was the foreign power that systematically attacked our democratic institutions in 2016. This is the public conclusion of our intelligence agencies, confirmed in bipartisan congressional reports. It is beyond dispute, even if some of the underlying details must remain classified. The impact of the successful 2016 Russian campaign remains evident today. Our nation is being torn apart. Truth is questioned. Our highly professional and expert career foreign service is being undermined. US support for Ukraine, which continues to face armed Russian aggression, has been politicized. The Russian government's goal is to weaken our country, to diminish America's global role, and to neutralize a perceived US threat to Russian interests.
Their goal is to weaken our country, to diminish America's global role, and to neutralize a perceived U.S. threat to Russian interests. That's why it's so dangerous. Because despite the lack of any evidence to support this debunked conspiracy theory, the unanimous conclusion of the intelligence community, Congress, Special Counsel Mueller, and the FBI to the contrary, President Trump continued to promote this fake conspiracy theory just because it would be beneficial and helpful to his own reelection campaign. Even President Trump's own senior advisors told him these allegations were false. Tom Bossert, President Trump's former Homeland Security advisor, stated publicly that the CrowdStrike theory had been debunked. Here's that interview. Let's watch.
It's not only a conspiracy theory, it is completely debunked. You know, I don't want to be glib about this matter, but last year, retired former Senator Judd Gregg wrote a piece in the Hill magazine saying the 3 ways or the 5 ways to impeach oneself. And the 3rd way was to hire Rudy Giuliani. And at this point, I am deeply frustrated with what he and the legal team is doing and repeating that debunked theory to the president. It sticks in his mind when he hears it over and over again. And for clarity here, George, let me just again repeat that it has no validity. The United States government reached its conclusion on attributing to Russia the DNC hack in 2016 before it even communicated it to the FBI and long before the FBI ever knocked on the door at the DNC. So a server inside the DNC was not relevant to our determination to the attribution. It was made up front and beforehand. And so while servers can be important in some of the investigations that followed, it has nothing to do with the U.S. government's attribution of Russia for the DNC hack.
The theory has no validity. That's what he said. Dr. Hill, too, testified that White House officials, including Mr. Bossert and former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, spend a lot of time refuting the CrowdStrike conspiracy theory to President Trump. Let's hear it.
Now, Dr. Hill, is this a reference to this debunked conspiracy theory about Ukraine interference in the 2016 election that you discussed at in your opening statement as well as with Chairman Schiff?
The reference to CrowdStrike and the server, yes, that's correct.
And it is your understanding that there is no basis for these allegations, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, isn't it also true that some of President Trump's most senior advisors had informed him that this theory of Ukraine interference in the 2016 election was false?
That's correct.
When she was asked, is it false, she said, that's correct. If Vladimir Putin's goals, as Dr. Hill testified, were to deflect from Russia's systematic interference in our election and to drive a wedge between the United States and Ukraine, he has succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The alternative narrative of Ukrainian interference on the 2016 election has now been picked up by the president's defenders and the conservative media. It has muddled the waters regarding Russia's own interference in our elections, efforts that remain ongoing, as we have learned this week from reporting that Russia hacked Burisma. If there were any doubt about how President Putin feels about the president's conduct, you need only look to Putin's own words. His statement on November 20 tells it all. Quote, "Thank God nobody is accusing us anymore of interfering in U.S. elections. Now they're accusing Ukraine." That's a short quotation from Putin, but it speaks volumes. Even though President Trump knew that there was no factual basis for the theory that it was Ukraine that interfered in the 2016 election rather than Russia, and knew that Russia was perpetuating this theory, he still wanted President Zelensky to pursue the investigation. Why? Because while Putin and Russia clearly stood to gain by promoting this conspiracy theory about Ukraine, so did Donald Trump. He knew it would be politically helpful to his 2020 election. An announcement of an investigation by Ukraine would have breathed new life into a debunked conspiracy theory that Ukrainian election interference was there in 2016, and it lended great credibility. It would have cast doubt on the conclusions of the Intelligence Committee and Special Counsel Mueller that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to help President Trump. And it would have helped eliminate a perceived threat to the legitimacy of Donald Trump's presidency, that he was only elected because of the help he received from President Putin. I now yield to Mr. Schiff.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Demand that we take a 15-minute break at this point.
Without objection, so ordered. Senate will come to order. Mr. Manager Schiff.
Senators, I'm going to pick up where my colleague from Texas left off, but I wanted to begin by underscoring a few of the points that she made in listening to her presentation that really leapt out at me in a way they hadn't leapt out at me before. But first, I wanted to address my colleague shared a number of slides showing the polling strength of Joe Biden vis-a-vis the president as a demonstration of his motive, the fact that he went after these political investigations to undermine someone that he was deeply concerned about. This is an appropriate point for me to make the disclaimer: the House managers take no position in the Democratic primary for president. I don't want to lose a single more vote than necessary. But those polls do show a powerful motive that Donald Trump had, a motive that he didn't have the year before or the year before that, a motive that he didn't have when he allowed the aid to go to Ukraine without complaint or issue in 2017 or 2018. It was only when he had a growing concern with Joe Biden's candidacy that he took a sudden interest in Ukraine and Ukraine funding and the withholding of that aid. But I also want to underscore what the president said in that July 25th call. When my colleague showed you again that transcript from July 25th where the president says, "I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike." Now, my colleagues have explained what that theory is about that server, that CrowdStrike server. The crazy theory that it was Ukraine that hacked the Democratic server, and that server was whisked away to Ukraine and hidden there so that the investigators, the FBI, couldn't look at this server, okay? That's what Donald Trump was raising in that conversation with President Zelensky. Now, I bring this point up again, because you may hear from my colleagues, the president's lawyers, as we heard during the testimony in the House, that the concern was over Ukrainian interference in the election, and why isn't it possible that both Russia and Ukraine interfered in the election? Now, never mind, that's contrary to all the evidence. But it's important to point out here that we're not talking about generic interference. We're not talking about, as we heard from some of my colleagues in the House, a tweet from a Ukrainian here or an op-ed written by somebody there and equating it with the kind of systematic interference of the Russians. What we're talking about here, what the president is talking about here, is a very specific conspiracy theory going to the server itself, meaning that it was Ukraine that hacked the Democratic server, not the Russians. This theory was brought to you by the Kremlin. Okay? So we're not talking about generic interference. We're talking about the server. We're talking about CrowdStrike. At least that's what Donald Trump wanted to investigate or announced. This completely bogus, Kremlin-pushed conspiracy theory. Now, I was also struck by that video you saw of Tom Bossert, the former Homeland Security advisor for the president, in which he talked about how completely debunked and crazy this conspiracy theory is. And there was that, rather glib line that was, he admitted was glib, but nonetheless made a point, the 3 or 5 ways to impeach oneself, and the third way was to hire Rudy Giuliani. Now, it struck me in watching that clip again that it's important to emphasize that Rudy Giuliani is not some Svengali here who has the president under his control. There may be an effort to say, okay, the human hand grenade Rudy Giuliani, it's all his fault. He had the president in his grip, And even though the U.S. intelligence agencies and the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee and everyone else told the president time after time, this is nonsense, the Russians interfered, not the Ukrainians, that he just couldn't shake himself of what he was hearing from Rudy Giuliani. You can say a lot of things about President Trump, but he is not led by the nose by Rudy Giuliani. And if he is willing to listen to his personal lawyer over his own intelligence agencies, his own advisors, then you can imagine what a danger that presents to this country. Now, my colleague also played for you that interview with Director Wray, and again, I was just struck anew by that interview. And in that interview, Director Wray says, "We have no information that indicates that Ukraine interfered with the 2016 presidential election." That is Donald Trump's director of the FBI. We have no information that indicates Ukraine interfered with the 2016 election. None, as in zero. The reporter then says, when you see politicians pushing this notion, are you concerned about that in terms of the impact on the American public? And the director says, well, look, there's all kind of people saying all kind of things out there. Well, yes, there are, but this person was the President of the United States. When he says there's all kinds of people out there saying all kinds of things, what he's really saying is the President of the United States. It's one thing if someone off the street says it, but when it's coming from the President of the United States, you can see what a danger it is if it is patently false and it is promulgated by the Russians. And again, the reporter says, and we heard from the president himself, he wanted the CrowdStrike portion of this whole conspiracy investigated. And I'm hearing you saying there's no evidence to support this. And Wray says, as I said, we at the FBI have no information that would indicate that Ukraine tried to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. None. And so you can imagine the view from the Kremlin of all of this. You can imagine Putin in the Kremlin with his aides. When one of his aides comes into the office and says, Vladimir, you're never going to believe this. The President of the United States is pushing our CrowdStrike theory. I mean, you can almost imagine the incredulity of Vladimir Putin. You're kidding, right? You mean he really believes this? His own people don't believe this. Nobody believes this. And it's not, I mean, it would be bad enough, of course, that the President of the United States believes this Russian propaganda against the advice of all of his advisors, common sense and everything else. But it's worse than that. It's worse than that. On the basis of this Russian propaganda, he withheld $400 million in military aid to a nation Russia was fighting, our ally. I mean, when we ask about, okay, what's the national security implication of what the president did? How much more clear can it be that he's not only pushing Russian propaganda, he's not only misleading Americans about who interfered in the last election, that he's not only doing the Kremlin a favor, but that he's withholding aid from a nation at war. The Russians not only got him to deflect blame from their interference in our democracy, but they got him to withhold military aid. Now, of course, there was this convergence of interest between the Kremlin and the president. The president wasn't pushing Kremlin talking points just to do Vladimir Putin a favor. He was doing it because it helped him. Because it helped him. Because it could get these talking points for him in his re-election campaign. And for that, he would sacrifice our ally and our own security. But nothing struck me more from Representative Garcia's presentation than that quote from Vladimir Putin. from November of this past year, so just a couple months ago. Thank God, Putin said, thank God nobody is accusing us anymore of interfering in U.S. elections. Now they're accusing Ukraine. Thank God, Putin says. Well, you got to give Donald Trump credit for this. He has made a religious man out of Vladimir Putin. But I don't think we really want Vladimir Putin, our adversary, to be thanking God for the President of the United States, because they don't wish us well. They don't wish us well. They are a wounded animal. They are a declining power, but like any wounded animal, they are a dangerous animal. Their worldview is completely antithetical to ours. We do not want them thanking God for our president and what he is pushing out. We don't want them thanking God for withholding money from our ally, although we can understand why they may. And to me, that's what stuck out from that presentation. Now, we've walked through, in the first part of this presentation, the corrupt object of President Trump's scheme, getting Ukraine to announce these two political investigations that would benefit his reelection. And just looking at how baseless and fabricated the allegations behind them were, made plain his corrupt motive. But in addition to this overwhelming evidence, there are at least 10 other reasons we know that President Trump directed his scheme with corrupt intent. There are at least 10 other reasons we know that President Trump was interested in his own personal gain and not the national interest in pressing for these investigations. First, the president only wanted these investigations to be announced publicly, not even conducted. Second, the president's only interest in Ukraine was the big stuff that mattered to himself, not issues affecting Ukraine or the United States. Third, the president tasked his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to pursue these investigations on his behalf, not government officials. Fourth, both before and after the July 25th call, the investigations were never part of U.S. official foreign policy. NSC officials, too, make clear that this was not about foreign policy. And other witnesses confirmed the investigations, in fact, diverged from U.S. official policy. Fifth, the investigations were undertaken outside of normal channels. Sixth, Ukrainian officials understood that the investigations were purely political in nature. Seventh, multiple administration officials reported the president's July 25th call. Eighth, the White House buried the call. Ninth, President Trump confirmed he wanted Ukraine to conduct investigations in his own words. And finally, President Trump did not care about anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. Let's go through these one by one. First, perhaps the simplest way that we all know that President Trump wanted these investigations done solely to help his personal political interests and not the national interest is that he merely wanted a public announcement of the investigations, not an assurance that they would actually be done. If his desire for these investigations was truly to assist Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts, or because he was worried about the larger issues of corruption in Ukraine, someone actually investigating the facts underlying the investigations would have been most important. But he didn't care about the facts or the issues. He just wanted the political benefit of the public announcement of an investigation that he could use to damage his political opponent and boost his own political standing. Ambassador Gordon Sondland, who is at the center of the scheme, made this quite clear in his testimony.
Now, from Mr. Giuliani, by this point, you understood that in order to get that White House meeting that you wanted President Zelensky to have, and that President Zelensky desperately wanted to have, that Ukraine would have to initiate these two investigations. Is that right?
Well, they would have to announce that they were going to do it.
Right, because Giuliani and President Trump didn't actually care if they did them, right?
I never heard, Mr. Goldman, anyone say that the investigations had to start or had to be completed. The only thing I heard from Mr. Giuliani or otherwise was that they had to be announced in some form, and that form kept changing.
Announced publicly?
Announced publicly.
The other evidence gathered by the House's investigation confirms Ambassador Sondland's understanding. For example, recently the House received documents from Lev Parnas, an associate of Rudy Giuliani's, now indicted in response to a subpoena. As you know, Parnas was indicted by the Southern District of New York for crimes including election law violations. As part of the documents that Parnas turned over, we obtained handwritten notes that Parnas apparently took sometime in 2019. One of those notes lays out the scheme very clearly and succinctly. Now, it's not every day that you get a document like this, what appears to be a member of the conspiracy writing down the object of the conspiracy. But that's exactly what we see here. The scheme that ultimately was directed by President Trump to coerce Ukraine to announce the investigation of the Bidens. I repeat, to announce the investigations, not investigate, not conduct. The only thing that mattered was the public announcement. As this note says with an asterisk, get Zelensky to announce that the Biden case will be investigated. And in early September, after Mr. Giuliani and Ambassadors Volker and Sondland had tried but failed to get President Zelensky to issue a public statement, President Trump made this clear himself. He explained to Ambassador Bolton that he wanted Zelensky in a public box. That is, President Trump would only be satisfied if Zelensky made a public announcement of the investigations, which he subsequently agreed to do on CNN. Here's Ambassador Taylor's testimony on this.
And so even though President Trump was saying repeatedly that there is no quid pro quo, Ambassador Sondland relayed to you that the facts of the matter were that the White House meeting and the security assistance were conditioned on the announcement of these investigations. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
Now, you reference a television interview and a desire for President Trump to put Zelensky in a public box, which you also have in quotes. Was that in your notes?
It was in my notes.
And what did you understand that to mean, to put Zelensky in a public box?
I understood that to mean that President Trump, through Ambassador Sondland, was asking for President Zelensky to very publicly commit to these investigations, that it was not sufficient to do this in private, that this needed to be a very public statement.
The fact that the president only wanted a public announcement and not the investigations to actually be conducted demonstrates that his desire for investigations was simply and solely to boost his reelection efforts. Number two, turning to the second reason, President Trump's agents who helped carry out this scheme confirmed that his desire for Ukraine to announce the investigations was solely for his personal political benefit. As we will explain in more detail in a few minutes, President Trump never expressed any interest in the United States' anti-corruption policy towards Ukraine, nor did he care about Ukraine's war against Russia. He only expressed interest in one thing: investigating his political opponent. This was unequivocally confirmed by the testimony of David Holmes, the senior official in the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. The day after the July 25th call, Holmes overheard a conversation between President Trump and Ambassador Sondland, who was in Kyiv. The only topic they discussed related to Ukraine was the investigations. Here's his testimony.
Ambassador Sondland placed a call on his mobile phone, and I heard him announce himself several times along the lines of Gordon Sondland holding for the president. It appeared that he was being transferred through several layers of switchboards and assistants, and I then noticed Ambassador Sondland's demeanor changed and understood that he had been connected to President Trump. While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable, and Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do.
After the call, Ambassador Sondland confirmed to Holmes that the investigations were the president's sole interest with Ukraine because, and this is very important, they benefit the president.
After the call ended, Ambassador Sondland remarked that the president was in a bad mood. As Ambassador Sondland stated, it was often the case early in the morning. I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine. In particular, I asked Ambassador Sondland if it was true that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. I asked why not. And Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. The conversation then moved on to other topics.
This understanding by Ambassador Sondland is independently confirmed by President Trump's own interaction with Ukraine. During his 2 telephone calls with President Zelensky, first on April 21st and then on July 25th, President Trump did not refer to any anti-corruption efforts or the war against Russia. He never even uttered the word corruption. Instead, he only spoke about investigating his political opponents. He later confirmed this narrow and singular focus to the press. On October 3rd, when asked about the Ukraine scheme, he said, well, I would think if they were honest about it, they would start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. Here's that conference.
What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly. Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
So we know from witnesses, the president's personal agents, and most importantly, the president himself, the only thing President Trump cared about with Ukraine was his investigations to benefit himself. To see this even more starkly, it's helpful to remember what presidential head of state calls are normally used for. Talk to any former occupant of the Oval Office, and they will tell you that the disparity in power between the President of the United States and other heads of state is vast. Since World War II, and consistent with the requirement to faithfully execute their oath of office, U.S. presidents from both political parties have made good use of the disparity in power in their telephone calls with foreign leaders. They've used those calls to secure commitments that bolstered American security and prosperity. Acting as our chief diplomat, President Reagan used his calls to European allies like Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to rally the world against the Soviet threat, the shining city on the hill standing up to the evil empire. His calls laid the foundation for landmark nonproliferation agreements that averted a nuclear Armageddon. It was during a phone call on Christmas Day, 1991, that President George H.W. Bush learned that Mikhail Gorbachev intended to resign as Soviet premier, marking the end of the Soviet Union. Historians credit his deft diplomacy, including numerous one-on-one phone calls, for bringing about a peaceful end to the Cold War. Following September 11th, President George W. Bush used his calls with heads of state to rally global support for the U.S. campaign to defeat al-Qaeda, to work with our allies to protect and defend U.S. national security and combat terrorism. President Obama used his calls with foreign leaders to contain the fallout from the global economic crisis, assemble an international coalition to fight the Islamic State, and of course to rally support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion of Crimea. No matter what you think of the policy views or priorities of these prior presidents, there is no question that they are examples of the normal diplomacy that happens during presidential telephone calls. And there is no doubt when you're the President of the United States and you call a foreign leader, you are on the clock for the American people. Consistent with the faithful execution of his or her oath of office, a president's first and only objective is to get foreign leaders to do what is in the best interests of the United States. That's not what happened on July 25th. On that date, President Trump used a head of state call with the leader of Ukraine to help himself, to press a foreign leader to investigate the president's political opponent in order to help his re-election campaign. President Trump abused his authority as commander-in-chief and chief diplomat to benefit himself, and he betrayed the interests of the American people when he did so. Let's go to the third reason that we know the president put his interest first. The third reason you know that the investigations were politically motivated is the central role played by President Trump's personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, who has never had an official role in government, in this government, but instead was at all times representing the president in his personal capacity. There's no dispute about this. For example, Mr. Giuliani made this point clearly in his May 10 letter to the president of Ukraine himself, where he wrote, "Dear President-elect Zelensky, I am private counsel to President Donald J. Trump. Just to be precise, I represent him as a private citizen, not as President of the United States." This is quite common under American law because the duties and privileges of a president and a private citizen are not the same. Separate representation is the usual process. Mr. Giuliani also repeated this publicly. For example, he confirmed this point on May 9th in the New York Times, where he said, well, many things. He said, we're meddling in an election. We're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation, which we have a right to do. There's nothing illegal about it, he said. Somebody could say it's improper, and this isn't foreign policy. He went on to say, referring to the president, he basically knows what I'm doing, sure, as his lawyer. My only client is the President of the United States, he said. He's the one I have an obligation to report to, tell him what happened. Think about that. The president is using his personal lawyer to ask Ukraine for investigations that aren't, quote, foreign policy, but that will be very, very helpful to the president personally. It's not often you get it so graphically as we do here. Let's go to the fourth reason that these investigations were never part of U.S. policy. It wasn't just that President Trump used his personal lawyer. It's also that what he was asking for was never a part of U.S. policy. Witnesses told us that President Trump's investigations were not in his official prepared talking points or briefing materials. To the contrary, they went against official policy and diverged from our national security interests. All three witnesses, Tim Morrison at the National Security Council, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman at the Security Council, Jennifer Williams, who listened to the July 25th call, testified that when President Trump demanded that President Zelensky investigate the Bidens, he had completely departed from the talking points that they had prepared for him. Now, before I get to the video clip, I just want to underscore this. He's not obligated to use his talking points. He's not obligated to follow the recommendations of his staff, no matter how sound they may be. But what this makes clear is it wasn't U.S. policy that he was conducting. It was his private, personal interest that he was conducting. If it was U.S. policy, it probably would have been in the talking points and briefing materials, but of course it was not. Let's look at Mr. Morrison's testimony on this point.
Now, Mr. Morrison, were these references to CrowdStrike, the server, in 2016 election, and to Vice President Biden and his son, were they included in the president's talking points?
They were not.
And here's Lieutenant Colonel Vindman on this point.
Colonel Vindman, you are the National Security Council's director for Ukraine. Did you participate in preparing the talking points for the president's call?
I did. I prepared them.
So you prepared them. They were then reviewed and edited by multiple senior officers at the NSC and the White House. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did the talking points for the president contain any discussion of investigations into the 2016 election, the Bidens, or Burisma?
They did not.
Are you aware of any written product from the National Security Council suggesting that investigations into the 2016 election, the Bidens, or Burisma are part of the official policy of the United States?
No, I'm not.
Dr. Hill also elaborated on this point.
My point, Mr. Nunes, is that we at the National Security Council were not told, either by the President directly or through Ambassador Bolton, that we were to be focused on these issues as a matter of US foreign policy toward Ukraine. So when you're talking about Ukraine in 2016, I never personally heard the President say anything specific about 2016 in Ukraine. I've seen him saying plenty of things publicly, but I was not given a directive. In fact, I was given a directive on July 10th by Ambassador Bolton very clearly to stay out of domestic politics.
So to be clear, when President Trump asked for these investigations, he was not asking for them based on an official U.S. policy. His top official advisors had not even been told about these investigations. To the contrary, they were told to stay out of U.S. politics. And it gets worse. It was not just that President Trump ignored official U.S. policy and the talking points he was given. It was that what he was doing, withholding support from Ukraine, was actually contrary to and harmful to U.S. policy. There is clear and undisputed bipartisan support for Ukraine. Ukraine is our ally. What's more, they're at war with our adversary. So our goal should be helping President Zelensky's anti-corruption reforms and helping Ukraine fight its adversary, Russia, in any way that we can. President Trump's own national defense strategy stated that the United States and its European allies, quote, will deter Russian adventurism, end quote, a clear reference to Russia's usurpation of Ukrainian territory and sovereignty. Consistent with that strategy, we have currently approximately 68,000 troops stationed in Europe. Roughly 10,000 of those U.S. troops are deployed on NATO's eastern border with Russia to countries like Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, and Bulgaria. These American forces are literally holding the line against another land grab by Vladimir Putin. The author of that strategy, former U.S. National Security Advisor Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, issued this stark warning about Russia's aggression. For too long, some nations have looked the other way in the face of these threats. Russia brazenly and implausibly denies its actions, and we have failed to impose sufficient costs. The Kremlin's confidence is growing as its agents conduct their sustained campaigns to undermine our confidence in ourselves and in one another. What General McMaster says obviously makes sense. Russia's confidence, sadly, is growing. We need to stand up to them. And that's why we support Ukraine, to help defeat Russian aggression. So on July 25th, when President Zelensky spoke with President Trump, that's what he, McMaster, was hoping to discuss, or he would be hoping that he would discuss, how we can support Ukraine in its fight against a huge adversary. Our confidence in one another. That's what President Zelensky was most worried about when he got on the line with the president on July 25th, whether Ukraine could have confidence in U.S. support. Nearly 70% of Ukraine's territory, nearly 7% of Ukraine's territory had been annexed by Russian-backed forces. More than 15,000 troops have been lost in the hot war over the past 5 years. But when President Zelensky raised the issue of U.S. military aid needed to confront Russian aggression, President Trump did nothing to reassure the Ukrainian leader of our steadfast support for Ukraine's sovereignty. Instead, he made personal demands. It is for these reasons that President Trump's investigations went against official U.S. policy. Witnesses confirm that President Trump's request actually diverged not just from our policy, but from our own national security. As Dr. Hill testified, Ambassador Sondland, in carrying out President Trump's scheme, quote, was being involved in a domestic political errand, and we were being involved in national security policy, and those two things had just diverged. And as Ambassador Taylor elaborated, quote, our holding up of security assistance that would go to a country that is fighting aggression from Russia for no good policy reason, no good substantive reason, no good national security reason is wrong. As these officials so correctly observed, there's no question that President Trump's political errand and our national security diverged. That he did this to advance his reelection, not to advance U.S. national security goals, and that he did it for no good reason, but the political one. But it's more than that. It's more than our national security policy. We as a country are meant to embody the solution to corruption. Our country is based on promoting the rule of law. And here what the president did attacks another of the United States' strengths, that of our ideals and our values. Part of that is ensuring the integrity of our democracy and our political institutions. It is a fundamental American value that underlying our democracy that we do not use official powers to ask for investigations of our political opponents to gain a political advantage. When President Trump asked a foreign leader to investigate his political opponent, he abused the broad authority provided to the President of the United States. Witness testimony again confirms this. Vice President Pence's advisor, Jennifer Williams, was concerned by the President's focus on domestic political issues rather than U.S. national security, because the President is not supposed to use foreign governments for political errands. She characterized the call as a domestic political matter. Here is her testimony.
During my closed-door deposition, members of the committee asked about my personal views and whether I had any concerns about the July 25th call. As I testified then, I found the July 25th phone call unusual because, in contrast to other presidential calls I had observed, it involved discussion of what appeared to be a domestic political matter.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman also thought the call was improper and unrelated to the talking points he had drafted for the President.
It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. I was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation, it was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the 2016 elections, the Bidens and Burisma, it would be interpreted as a partisan play. This would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing bipartisan support, undermining U.S. national security, and advancing Russia's strategic objectives in the region.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who, as a reminder, is a Purple Heart veteran, says what we all know clearly. It's improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government to investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. And it wasn't just that Colonel Vindman thought that it was wrong. He was so concerned that he warned Ukraine, too, not to get involved in our domestic politics. In May, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman grew concerned by the pressure campaign he witnessed in the media, waged primarily by Rudy Giuliani. During a meeting with President Zelensky on May 20th, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman warned the Ukrainian leader to stay out of U.S. politics, because that is our official U.S. policy.
during a bilateral meeting in which the whole delegation was meeting with President Zelensky and his team, I offered two pieces of advice: to be particularly cautious with regards to Ukraine, to be particularly cautious with regards to Russia and its desire to provoke Ukraine, and the second one was to stay out of U.S. domestic policy.
You mean politics?
Politics, correct.
And why did you feel it was necessary to advise President Zelensky to stay away from U.S. domestic politics?
Chairman, in the March and April timeframe, became clear that there were actors in the U.S. Public actors, non-governmental actors, that were promoting the idea of investigations and 2016 Ukrainian interference, and it was consistent with U.S. policy to advise any country, all the countries in my portfolio, any country in the world, to not participate in U.S. domestic politics. So I was passing the same advice consistent with U.S. policy.
He once again makes this clear. It was consistent with U.S. policy to advise any country, all the countries in my portfolio, any country in the world, we do not participate in U.S. domestic politics. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State George Kent, too, testified that the president's political investigations, of course, had nothing to do with American anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine, which have consistently focused on building institutions and never specific investigations, and that if we do ask countries to do our political errands, it entirely threatens our credibility as a democracy.
You also testified on October 15th in the deposition about fundamental reforms necessary for Ukraine to fight corruption and to transform the country. And you cited the importance of reforming certain institutions, notably the security service and the prosecutor general's office. Was investigating President Trump's political opponents a part of those necessary reforms? Was it on that list of yours, sir, or indeed was it on any list?
No, they weren't.
In fact, historically, is it not true that a major problem in the Ukraine has been its misuse of prosecutors precisely to conduct investigation of political opponents? That's a legacy, I dare suggest, from the Soviet era, when, as you stated in your testimony, prosecutors like the KGB were, and I quote you now, instruments of oppression. Is that
I said
correct,
that,
sir?
and I believe it's true.
So finally, Mr. Kent, for as long as I can remember, U.S. foreign policy has been predicated on advancing principled interest in democratic values, notably freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, free, fair, and open elections, and the rule of law. Mr. Kent, when American leaders ask foreign governments to investigate their potential rivals, doesn't that make it harder for us to advocate on behalf of those democratic values?
I believe it makes it more difficult for our diplomatic representatives overseas to carry out those policy goals, yes.
How is that, sir?
Well, there's an issue of credibility. They hear diplomats on the ground saying one thing, and they hear other U.S. leaders saying something else.
The bottom line is this. What was in the best interests of our country was to help Ukraine, to give them the military aid, to fight one of our greatest adversaries, and to help promote the rule of law. And what was in President Trump's personal interest was the opposite, to pressure Ukraine to conduct investigations against his 2020 rival to help ensure his reelection. And when what is best for the country and what was best for Donald Trump diverged, President Trump put himself above the best interests of our country. Let's now go to the fifth reason that you know the president put himself first. The fifth reason is that the request for these investigations departed not just from U.S. policy, but from established U.S. government channels. On the July 25th call, President Trump told President Zelensky that he should speak to Mr. Giuliani and Attorney General Barr. But after the July 25th transcript was released, the Department of Justice disclaimed any knowledge or involvement in the president's political investigations. The Department of Justice statement from the day the July 25th call was released says this. This was from September 25th. The president has not spoken with the Attorney General about having Ukraine investigate anything relating to former Vice President Biden or his son. The president has not asked the Attorney General to contact Ukraine on this or any other matter. The Attorney General has not communicated with Ukraine on this or any other subject, nor has the Attorney General discussed this matter or anything relating to Ukraine with Rudy Giuliani. Now, this is pretty extraordinary. You can say a lot of things about the Attorney General, but you cannot say that he ever has looked to pursue something he thought was not in the president's interest. This is pretty extraordinary, where he is saying the moment this transcript is publicly released, I've got nothing to do with this scheme. I don't know why they brought me up in this call. I don't know why the president brought me up in this call. He hasn't asked me to do anything about this. I want nothing to do with this business. I suspect the Attorney General can recognize a drug deal when he sees it too. And he wanted nothing to do with this. Now, if this was some legitimate investigation, you would think the Department of Justice would have a role. That's traditionally how an investigation with an international component would work. But this wasn't the case. This wasn't the case. And the Attorney General wanted nothing to do with it. If these were legitimate investigations that were in the national interest, why was Bill Barr's Justice Department so quick to divorce themselves from it? The simple answer is that, as we see so clearly, they were against U.S. official policy and our national security. The Justice Department wanted nothing to do with it. And by asking for these investigations, the president was abusing his power. Let's go to the sixth reason. You know President Trump put himself first. It wasn't just that these witnesses told us what these witnesses told us in the impeachment hearings about this being wrong. They reported the president's conduct in real time. So it's not just that they came forward later. They came forward in real time to report the president's conduct. And of course, you've seen over the last couple of days how many times people are told, go talk to the lawyers. Both Tim Morrison, former Republican congressional staffer, and Colonel Vindman were sufficiently concerned by what they heard President Trump solicit on that July 25th call that they both immediately went to speak to the lawyers. John Eisenberg, the NSC legal advisor. Let's take a look.
Now, Mr. Morrison, shortly after you heard the July 25th call, you testified that you alerted the NSC legal advisor, John Eisenberg, pretty much right away. Is that right?
Correct.
And you indicated in your opening statement, or at least from your deposition, that you went to Mr. Eisenberg out of concern over the potential political fallout if the call record became public and not because you thought it was illegal. Is that right?
Correct.
But you would agree, right, that asking a foreign government to investigate a domestic political rival is inappropriate, would you not?
It's not what we recommended the president discuss.
Well, I think that's a profound understatement. Mr. Morrison clearly recognized that the request to investigate Biden and Burisma was about U.S. domestic politics and not U.S. national security. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman knew this too, and he reported his concerns to the White House counsel.
Now, you said you also reported this incident to the NSC lawyers, is that right?
Correct.
And what was their response?
John Eisenberg said that he took notes while I was talking, and he said that he would look into it.
Why did you report this meeting and this conversation to the NSC lawyers?
Because it was inappropriate, and following the meeting, I had a short conversation, following the post-meeting meeting in the wardroom, I had a short conversation with Dr. Hill, and we discussed the idea of needing to report this.
In fact, Colonel Vindman reported concerns twice, and Mr. Morrison did so multiple times as well. They weren't, of course, the only ones. As this slide shows, Dr. Hill reported her concerns to the NSC legal advisor. Mr. Kent reported his concerns at the State Department's failure to respond to House document requests. The lawyers were awfully busy. And why did President Trump's own officials, not so-called never-Trumpers, not Democrats or Republicans, but career public servants, report this conduct in real time? Because they knew it was wrong. Dr. Hill said it was improper and it was inappropriate, and we said that in real time. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman said the July 25th call was wrong, and he had a duty to report it. Ambassador Taylor said, quote, holding up of security assistance for no good policy reason, no good substantive reason, no good national security reason is wrong. Mr. Morrison admitted that he reported the July 25th call pretty much right away and recommended to them that we restrict access to the package. And Ms. Williams said that the July 25th call struck me as unusual and inappropriate and more political in nature. The consensus is once again clear. The president's demand for political investigations was improper, inappropriate, and wrong, and again confirms that these requested investigations were not about anything except Donald Trump's political gain. Let's go to the seventh reason why you know President Trump put himself first. American officials weren't the only ones who recognized the political nature of these requests. Ukrainian officials did too. And that brings us to the seventh reason we know that this was against our national interest. Ukrainian officials themselves expressed concern that these corrupt investigations would drag them into U.S. domestic politics. For example, in mid-July, Ambassador Taylor texted Sondland, and Taylor explained President Zelensky's reluctance to become a pawn in U.S. politics. Ambassador Taylor said, Gordon, one thing Kurt Volker, that is, one thing Kurt and I talked about yesterday was Sasha Danliuk's point, and he's a top advisor to President Zelensky, Sasha Danliuk's point that President Zelensky is sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously, not merely as an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics. So here you have Sasha Danliuk, one of the top advisors to Zelensky, affirming that his president wants to be taken seriously. It's pretty extraordinary when a foreign leader has to communicate to this country that they want to be taken seriously and not just as some kind of a pawn for political purposes. When an ally wholly dependent on us for military support, for economic support, for diplomatic support, has to say, please take us seriously. But this is what the Ukrainians are saying. They understood this wasn't American policy as much as we did. And they didn't want to be used as a pawn. Ambassador Taylor explained this text during his testimony. The whole thrust of this irregular channel, he said, was to get these investigations, which Danliuk and presumably Zelensky were resisting because they didn't want to be seen to be interfering, but also to be a pawn. So this is an important point too, which is it wasn't just that they didn't want to be seen as getting involved in U.S. politics, because if they did, and it looked like they were getting involved on the side of Donald Trump, then it would hurt their support with Democrats. If it looked like they were getting involved on the other side, it would hurt them with the president. It wasn't just that there was no benefit to Ukraine to be dragged into this. There was no benefit to Ukraine by this. But they also didn't want to be viewed as a pawn. I mean, President Zelensky's got his own electorate. He's this new leader. He's a former comedian. And he wants to be taken seriously. He needs to be taken seriously, because if the U.S. won't take him seriously, you can darn well bet Vladimir Putin isn't going to take him seriously. And so the perception, not just that there's a rift, that he can't get military aid or it's in doubt or in question, but the impression that he's nothing more than a pawn. You could see how problematic that was for President Zelensky. In other words, Ukrainian officials understood, just as our officials understood, just as all those folks you just saw, Morrison and Vindman and Hill and others, and all the people who had to go to the lawyers, all the people listened to that call and understood this is just wrong. Now, Morrison goes on to say that he's no legal expert and can't really opine on the legality of what happened in this call. But they all knew it was wrong. They also knew that it was damaging to bipartisan support. They knew it was damaging to our national security. But here we see it wasn't just our people, it was Ukrainians who also understood this was a pure political errand they were being asked to perform. It's no way to treat an ally at war. Now, it wasn't just the testimony of U.S. officials on this. We know this directly from the Ukrainians. Indeed, we know this directly from President Zelensky himself, who said, quote, "I'm sorry, but I don't want to be involved to democratic open elections of the USA." Here's Zelensky saying, I don't want to be involved. I don't want to be involved. And he shouldn't be involved. He shouldn't be involved in our elections. That's not his job. And he knows that. And it's a tragic fact that the world's oldest democracy has to be told by the struggling democracy, this isn't what you're supposed to do. But that's what's happening here. Let's go to the eighth reason why you can know that President Trump put himself first. And that is, there's no serious dispute that the White House tried to bury the call record. They tried to bury the call record. Although President Trump has repeatedly insisted that his July 25th conversation with President Zelensky was perfect, the White House apparently believed otherwise. Their own lawyers apparently believed otherwise. Following a head of state call, the White House normally issues a public summary or readout to lock in any commitments made by the foreign leader and publicly reinforce the core elements of the president's message. However, no public readout was posted on the White House website following the July 25th call. I wonder why that was. The White House instead provided reporters with a short, incomplete summary that, of course, omitted the major elements of that conversation. The short summary said, today, President Donald J. Trump spoke by telephone with President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine to congratulate him on his recent election. President Trump and President Zelensky discussed ways to strengthen the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, including energy and economic cooperation. Both leaders also expressed that they look forward to the opportunity to meet. That was it. Now, I don't know about you, but that does not seem like an accurate summary of that call. As you can see, that summary did not mention President Trump's repetition of a debunked conspiracy theory about the 2016 election promoted by Russian President Putin. The summary did not mention President Trump's demand that Ukraine announce an investigation into his domestic political rival, former Vice President Biden. The summary did not mention that President Trump praised a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor who to this day continues to feed false claims to the president through Rudy Giuliani. If the call was perfect, if these investigations were legitimate, if the White House had nothing to hide, then ask yourselves, why did the White House readout omit any mention of these investigations? Why not publicly confirm that Ukraine had been asked by the president to pursue them? Why? Because it would have exposed the president's corruption. But sanitizing the call readout wasn't the only step taken to cover up the president's wrongdoing. The White House counsel's office also took irregular efforts to hide the call record away on a secure server used to store highly classified information. National Security Council Senior Director Tim Morrison, who you saw video clips of, testified that he requested that access to the electronic file of the call record be restricted so that it couldn't leak. Mr. Morrison said the call record did not Mr. Morrison said the call record did not